In the dusty town of Dead Rock Gulch, Arizona Territory, everyone knew Delaney Rose McGraw as the poor cowgirl with the patched-up hat and the ornery mule. When she inherited her uncle's worthless homestead, the townsfolk called it McGraw's Folly, nothing but sand, cacti, and old ghost stories. They laughed at her behind her back, watching her struggle to make something of the barren land with nothing but grit and determination. But beneath that cracked desert earth lay a secret that would change everything. A hidden silver vein worth $120 million had been waiting since the 1850s, left untapped when a mysterious miner vanished without a trace. The moment Delaney discovered that glimmering fortune, her name went from mockery to every miner's lips. Suddenly, the same people who once spat her name were lining up to court her favor. Will Delaney's newfound wealth bring the redemption she's always dreamed of, or will it destroy the only home she's ever known? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Dead Rock Gulch as Delaney Rose McGraw made her way toward Henderson's general store, her worn boots kicking up small clouds of Arizona dust with each step. At 28, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned early that respect was earned through actions, not words. Her auburn hair, streaked with premature silver from years under the desert sun, was pulled back in a practical bun beneath her father's old hatter-brown felt piece that had seen better days, its brim carefully mended with leather patches that told stories of hard-won survival. The silver locket at her throat caught the morning light, its tarnished surface bearing the weight of memory. Inside lay the only photograph she possessed of her parents Thomas and Mary McGraw taken on their wedding day in 1845. She touched it now, a habit that brought comfort during moments of uncertainty, feeling the slight warmth of the metal against her fingertips. The locket had been her mother's, passed down through generations of McGraw women, each one stronger than the last. "Morning, Delaney," called out Mrs. Henderson from behind the counter, her voice carrying the particular tone reserved for those who paid their bills on time but never had much to spend. "Got your usual order ready?" Delaney nodded, counting out the coins from her small leather purse. 2 pounds of flour, a tin of beans, and a small sack of coffee enough to last her through the week, if she was careful. She'd been careful for as long as she could remember, stretching every dollar until it screamed for mercy. The boarding house where she rented a small room above the saloon took most of her earnings from the various jobs she picked up around town mending clothes for the ladies, helping with harvest time at the Morrison place, and occasionally breaking horses for ranchers who needed steady hands and weren't particular about gender. "Heard tell you might be coming into some property." Mrs. Henderson continued, her eyes bright with the kind of curiosity that small towns bred like wildflowers after rain. "Your Uncle Jeremiah, God rest his soul." The news had reached Dead Rock Gulch 3 days ago, carried by the weekly mail rider who brought word from the territorial capital. Jeremiah McGraw, her father's older brother, had passed away in his sleep at the age of 73, leaving behind a homestead 20 miles northeast of town and a will that mentioned his only living relative. Delaney had met him perhaps a dozen times throughout her childhood, a quiet man with kind eyes who visited their family farm before the influenza took her parents when she was 16. "Yes, ma'am," Delaney replied, gathering her supplies. "Seems Uncle Jeremiah remembered me after all these years." Mrs. Henderson leaned forward conspiratorially. "Well, I hope it's more than that patch of desert he was squatting on. Nothing out there but sand, scorpions, and old ghost stories. Folks been calling it cursed land ever since that miner disappeared back in '53. The bell above the door chimed as Mayor Cornelius Blackwood entered, his expensive suit, a stark contrast to the simple working clothes of most townspeople. At 55, he carried himself with the authority of a man who had never doubted his place in the world, his silver hair perfectly groomed, and his boots polished to a shine that spoke of servants and prosperity. He was followed by his nephew, Marcus Blackwood, a younger man whose pale eyes held the calculating look of someone always measuring angles and opportunities. "Miss McGraw," the mayor nodded formally. "I understand congratulations are in order regarding your inheritance." "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," Delaney replied, instinctively straightening her shoulders. The Blackwood family had owned the largest ranch in the territory for 3 generations, and their opinion carried weight in matters of land and law. "I hope you'll consider our offer to purchase the property," Marcus interjected smoothly. "It's rough country out there, hardly suitable for a woman living alone. We'd be willing to offer a fair price enough to set you up comfortably in town." Delaney felt her jaw tighten. "I haven't even seen the place yet, Mr. Blackwood. Seems premature to be discussing sales." The mayor's smile was patronizing. Of course. But when you do see it, you'll understand why we're being generous. That land has been nothing but trouble for decades. Better to cut your losses before you get too attached." As the Blackwoods conducted their business with Mrs. Henderson, Delaney slipped quietly from the store, her mind churning with questions. Why would the most powerful family in the territory be so eager to buy land they claimed was worthless? The contradiction settled uneasily in her stomach as she made her way down Main Street toward the blacksmith shop. The rhythmic sound of hammer on anvil grew louder as she approached, accompanied by the hiss of hot metal meeting water. Colt Ramirez worked with the focused intensity of a man who took pride in his craft, his dark hair damp with sweat, muscular forearms flexing as he shaped a horseshoe with precision and care. At 32, he possessed the quiet confidence of someone who had seen the world beyond Dead Rock Gulch, but chose to make his home in this small corner of the territory. "Morning, Colt," Delaney called out, setting down her packages on a wooden crate near the door. He looked up, his brown eyes crinkling at the corners with genuine warmth. "Morning, Delaney. Heard about your uncle. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," she replied, appreciating that he didn't immediately launch into speculation about her inheritance. "I was wondering if you might have time this week to look at my mule's shoes. Stubborn old Gus has been favoring his left front hoof." "Of course," Colt said, setting down his hammer. "No charge for you. You helped my sister Elena when she was sick last spring, remember? Never did properly thank you for that." The memory brought a small smile to Delaney's face. Elena Ramirez had been burning with fever for 3 days, and the town doctor had been away delivering a baby at the Morrison Ranch. Delaney had spent 2 nights applying cold cloths and administering the herbal remedies her mother had taught her, staying until the fever broke and the young woman was out of danger. "Your sister's a good woman," Delaney said. "She would have done the same for me." "She would have," Colt agreed. "But you're the one who did it. That matters." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jake Morrison, a rancher in his 40s whose weathered face bore the permanent squint of someone who spent his days scanning distant horizons. He dismounted from his horse with the careful movements of a man whose joints had absorbed too many years of hard riding and harder falls. "Delaney," he nodded curtly, "heard you inherited old Jeremiah's place. You planning to actually live out there?" "I'm planning to take a look first," she replied evenly. "Make my decisions based on what I find." Jake spat into the dust. "What you'll find is trouble. That land's been cursed since Black Pete Morrison disappeared. No relation to me, mind you, different Morrison entirely. But folks say he buried something out there before he vanished. Gold, silver, who knows what. Point is, nothing good comes from that place." "Superstitions," Colt said quietly, but his voice carried a note of caution. "Though it's true, the land has a history." "History," Jake repeated. "That's one word for it. Another word might be haunted. You ask me, you'd be smart to sell to the Blackwoods and be done with it. Use the money to buy yourself a nice little place in town, maybe find yourself a husband who can provide for you proper." Delaney's temper flared, but she kept her voice steady. "I appreciate the advice, Mr. Morrison, but I'm quite capable of making my own decisions." "Suit yourself," Jake shrugged. "But don't say you weren't warned when that place starts showing you its true colors." After Jake left, Colt and Delaney stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the dust settle in the street. The blacksmith's shop felt like a sanctuary, filled with the honest smells of iron and coal, the tools of a trade that built rather than destroyed. "You don't believe in curses," Delaney said finally, making it half question, half statement. Colt wiped his hands on his leather apron. "I believe in being careful, and I believe in people making their own choices without half the town telling them what to do." "The Blackwoods seem mighty interested in buying land they claim isn't worth much," Delaney observed. "The Blackwoods are interested in controlling as much territory as possible," Colt replied diplomatically. "It's what powerful families do. But you think there might be more to it?" Colt met her eyes directly. "I think your uncle was a smart man who kept his own counsel. If he left you that land, he had his reasons. Maybe you should find out what they were before you make any decisions." As Delaney walked back toward the boarding house, the weight of the silver locket seemed heavier against her chest. The photograph inside showed her parents on their wedding day, young and hopeful, standing before a future they couldn't possibly have imagined. Her father had been a dreamer, always talking about the potential hidden in the harsh desert landscape. Her mother had been the practical one, feet firmly planted on the ground, but with eyes that sparkled when Thomas spoke of possibilities. Now, facing her own crossroads, Delaney wondered what they would have advised. Would they have counseled caution, urged her to take the safe path and sell to the Blackwoods? Or would they have encouraged her to follow her instincts, to see what Uncle Jeremiah had really left her? The boarding house stood at the end of Main Street, a two-story structure that had seen better days, but still maintained a certain dignity. Mrs. Patterson, the widow who ran the establishment, kept it clean and respectable, charging fair rates for simple rooms and basic meals. Delaney's room was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the desert toward the mountains. That evening, as she sat by her window watching the sun set over the distant peaks, Delaney made her decision. Tomorrow, she would ride out to see Uncle Jeremiah's homestead for herself. She would ignore the warnings and the well-meaning advice, the offers to buy and the predictions of doom. She would trust her own judgment, just as her parents had taught her to do. The silver locket caught the last rays of sunlight, and for a moment, Delaney could almost hear her mother's voice. "Trust your heart, darling. It knows the way forward, even when your mind is full of doubt." As darkness settled over Dead Rock Gulch, Delaney Rose McGraw prepared for the journey that would change her life forever. She had no way of knowing that beneath the desert floor, a fortune in silver waited to be discovered, or that her uncle's seemingly worthless inheritance would soon make her the most talked-about woman in the territory. All she knew was that tomorrow she would begin to write the next chapter of her story, one that would be hers alone to tell. The ride to Uncle Jeremiah's homestead took Delaney through 20 miles of unforgiving desert landscape, where saguaro cacti stood like ancient sentinels against the endless blue sky. Gus, her faithful mule, picked his way carefully along the barely visible trail, his ears swiveling at every sound in the vast silence. The morning sun climbed steadily overhead, promising another scorching day in the Arizona territory. As they crested a low ridge, the homestead came into view, a modest adobe structure that seemed to grow from the desert floor itself. The building was larger than she'd expected, with thick walls designed to keep the interior cool during the blazing summers and warm during the cold desert nights. A small barn stood nearby, its roof partially collapsed, and a hand-dug well marked the center of what had once been a modest yard. Delaney dismounted and tied Gus to a hitching post that Uncle Jeremiah had carved from a sturdy mesquite branch. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the creosote bushes and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. She stood for a moment, absorbing the isolation and the strange sense of peace that seemed to emanate from the place. The front door stood slightly ajar, its leather hinges dried and cracked by years of desert weather. Delaney pushed it open carefully, stepping into the cool dimness of the interior. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that filtered through small windows, and the air held the faint scent of sage and old wood smoke. Uncle Jeremiah had lived simply. A rough-hewn table occupied the center of the main room, surrounded by two handmade chairs. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel decorated with a few books and a collection of interesting rocks. In one corner stood a narrow bed covered with a colorful quilt that looked like her aunt's handiwork from years past. The kitchen area was equally sparsy cast-iron stove, some basic cookware, and shelves lined with preserving jars that still held traces of beans and dried corn. But it was the corner near the fireplace that drew her attention. There, half buried beneath a pile of old newspapers and correspondence, lay a rusted pickaxe. The tool was ancient, its wooden handle worn smooth by countless hands, the iron head pitted with age and neglect. Something about it called to her, and she lifted it carefully, surprised by its weight and the way it seemed to fit naturally in her grip. As she examined the pickaxe, Delaney noticed faded letters carved into the handle, PM 1853. Her breath caught as she remembered Jake Morrison's words about Black Pete Morrison, the mysterious miner who had disappeared decades ago. Could this have belonged to him? And if so, how had it come to rest in Uncle Jeremiah's cabin? A thorough search of the cabin revealed little else of interest: some clothing, basic supplies, and a few personal effects that spoke of a man who had valued solitude and simplicity. She found no letters, no diary, no explanation for why her uncle had chosen to leave her this remote piece of desert. But the pickaxe seemed to pulse with possibility in her hands, as if it held secrets waiting to be uncovered. That evening, Delaney made camp in the cabin, building a small fire in the stone fireplace and preparing a simple meal from her supplies. As darkness settled over the desert, the silence deepened, broken only by the distant howl of coyotes and the whisper of wind through the gaps in the walls. She lay on Uncle Jeremiah's narrow bed, staring up at the rough wooden beams of the ceiling, wondering what had drawn her uncle to this isolated place and why he had chosen to spend his final years here alone. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of shadowy figures and glittering promises hidden beneath the desert floor. She woke before dawn to the sound of something moving outside the cabina, scraping, scratching noise that seemed to come from near the well. Wrapping Uncle Jeremiah's old coat around her shoulders, she stepped outside into the cool, pre-dawn air. The eastern horizon was just beginning to show the first pale hints of sunrise when she saw a large diamondback rattlesnake, its scales gleaming dully in the early light, coiled near the base of the well. The serpent was magnificent and deadly, its rattle buzzing a warning as it sensed her presence. But something about its behavior struck her as odd. Instead of slithering away or adopting a defensive posture, the snake seemed to be investigating something near the well's edge. Delaney fetched the old pickaxe from the cabin, using its length to gently encourage the rattlesnake to move away from the well. The serpent, apparently satisfied with its exploration, glided smoothly toward a dry creek bed that wound its way past the homestead and disappeared into the desert beyond. Something in its unhurried movement suggested purpose, as if it knew exactly where it was going. Curiosity overcoming caution, Delaney followed at a safe distance, the pickaxe still in her hands. The creek bed was perhaps 6 feet wide and 3 feet deep, carved by flash floods that came roaring down from the mountains during the brief but violent desert storms. Now it was bone dry, its sandy bottom dotted with smooth river rocks and the occasional piece of driftwood that spoke of waters long since vanished. The rattlesnake had disappeared into a tangle of Palo Verde trees that grew along one bank of the creek, but Delaney's attention was caught by something else entirely. There, embedded in the creek bank where centuries of erosion had worn away the soil, was a glittering vein of what looked like silver ore. The metal caught the early morning light, throwing back reflections that seemed almost too bright to be real. Delaney knelt beside the exposed vein, her heart pounding with sudden excitement. She had seen enough silver ore in her life to recognize the real thing, and this deposit was unlike anything she had ever encountered. The vein was thick, perhaps 3 feet wide, and appeared to run deep into the bank. With trembling hands, she used the pickaxe to chip away at the surrounding rock, exposing more of the precious metal. The ore was incredibly pure, shot through with veins of almost solid silver that gleamed like captured starlight. As she worked, more and more of the deposit became visible, revealing what appeared to be a massive silver lode that had been hidden beneath the desert for countless years. Her uncle's seemingly worthless homestead sat directly above what might be one of the richest silver strikes in the territory's history. Standing in the dry creek bed, with the ancient pickaxe in her hands and silver ore glittering at her feet, Delaney Rose McGraw felt the earth shift beneath her life. Everything she had known about her circumstances, her future, and her place in the world suddenly transformed in that moment of discovery. The poor cowgirl who had ridden out to claim a worthless inheritance had just become the owner of what might be the richest silver mine in Arizona territory. But even as excitement coursed through her veins, a cold voice of caution whispered in her mind. If this deposit was as valuable as it appeared, then Uncle Jeremiah must have known about it. Why had he never exploited it? Why had he lived in poverty when fortune lay literally beneath his feet? And why were the Blackwoods so eager to buy land they claimed was worthless? As the sun climbed higher and the desert began to shimmer with heat, Delaney carefully covered the exposed silver with loose rocks and sand, disguising her discovery from casual observation. She memorized every detail of the location, noting the distinctive rock formations and the way the creek bed curved around a massive boulder that would serve as a landmark. The ride back to Dead Rock Gulch passed in a blur of racing thoughts and barely contained excitement. She forced herself to maintain a normal pace, knowing that any sign of urgency or excitement might draw unwanted attention. By the time she reached town, she had made several crucial decisions. First, she would tell no one about her discovery until she could research the legal requirements for filing a mining claim. Second, she would return to the homestead as soon as possible to better assess the extent of the silver deposit. And third, she would find out everything she could about Black Pete Morrison and what had really happened to him in 1853. As she stabled Gus behind the boarding house and climbed the stairs to her small room, Delaney felt the weight of the secret she now carried. The silver ore in her pocket seemed to burn against her palm, a tangible reminder that her life had just taken a turn that she could never have imagined. The poor cowgirl was about to become one of the wealthiest women in the territory if she could figure out how to claim her inheritance without losing her life in the process. For 3 days, Delaney carried her secret like a burning coal in her chest, going through the motions of her ordinary life, while her mind raced with possibilities and plans. She mended Mrs. Patterson's kitchen curtains, helped unload supplies at Henderson's general store, and broke a particularly stubborn Mustang for the Morrison Ranch, all while the silver ore sample remained hidden in a small pouch beneath her mattress. Each night, she would examine the sample by candlelight, running her fingers over the pure veins of metal and marveling at her fortune. But the excitement was tempered by a growing sense of unease. Too many questions remained unanswered, and too many people seemed interested in land they claimed was worthless. On the 4th day, while organizing Uncle Jeremiah's belongings in preparation for another trip to the homestead, she made a discovery that sent chills down her spine. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the fireplace, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a hand-drawn map that appeared to date from the 1850s. The paper was yellowed and fragile, covered with careful notations in faded ink. The surveyor's map showed the original territorial land grants and mining claims from decades past, including detailed boundaries that had long since been forgotten or deliberately obscured. According to the map, Uncle Jeremiah's property encompassed not just the homestead and immediate surrounding area, but a much larger tract that extended deep into the desert and included several natural landmarks she recognized. Most significantly, the map showed the location of mining claims filed by one P. Morrison in 1853, complete with detailed surveys and legal descriptions. The claims covered exactly the area where she had discovered the silver vein, suggesting that Black Pete Morrison had indeed known about the deposit and had filed legal papers to establish his right to mine it. But according to the map's notations, Morrison's claims had never been formally registered with the territorial government. The paperwork existed, but it had never been submitted, leaving the mineral rights in legal limbo for more than 30 years. If Uncle Jeremiah had somehow acquired Morrison's original survey maps and claim documents, it would explain both his knowledge of the silver and his reluctance to exploit it. Armed with this new information, Delaney returned to the homestead the following morning, the surveyor's map carefully hidden in her saddlebags, alongside her growing collection of tools and supplies. She had purchased a proper mining kit from Henderson's store, claiming she wanted to prospect for garnets and other semi-precious stones as a hobby. Mrs. Henderson had seemed satisfied with the explanation, though she warned Delaney about the dangers of wandering the desert alone. At the homestead, Delaney used the surveyor's map to establish the exact boundaries of her property, marking corners with small cairns of stacked stones. The work was hot and exhausting, but it gave her a clear understanding of just how much land Uncle Jeremiah had left her. According to the map, her property included not just the silver vein she had discovered, but potentially several other mineral deposits marked with cryptic symbols and notations. Working carefully to avoid attracting attention, she returned to the dry creek bed and began a systematic exploration of the silver deposit. What she found exceeded her wildest expectations. The vein was not merely a surface manifestation, but appeared to be part of a much larger underground lode that extended deep into the earth. Using the old pickaxe and her new mining tools, she was able to extract several pounds of high-grade ore from the exposed face of the deposit. But the more she learned about the extent of the silver, the more puzzled she became about Uncle Jeremiah's behavior. The ore was so pure and plentiful that even a modest mining operation could have made him wealthy beyond imagination. Why had he chosen to live in poverty when such riches lay literally beneath his feet? The answer came to her as she was examining a particularly rich section of the vein. Carved into the rock face, barely visible beneath decades of mineral deposits and erosion, were the same initials she had seen on the pickaxe, PM 1853. Below them, in smaller letters, were the words, "Here lies my doom." The inscription sent a chill through her despite the desert heat. What had Black Pete Morrison meant by those ominous words? Had he recognized that the silver would bring more trouble than blessing? And had Uncle Jeremiah shared that fear, choosing poverty over the dangers that might come with great wealth? As she worked, Delaney became aware that she was not entirely alone in the desert. Twice, she caught glimpses of dust clouds on distant ridges, suggesting that riders were moving through the area. The presence of others might be coincidental ranchers checking on cattle, travelers passing through, or simply other prospectors trying their luck in the territory. But something about the way the dust clouds appeared and disappeared suggested deliberate surveillance rather than casual travel. On her third day of exploration, her suspicions were confirmed. She was working at the creek bed, carefully extracting ore samples and mapping the extent of the deposit, when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Quickly covering her work with loose rocks and sand, she scrambled up the bank and took cover behind a large boulder, her heart pounding with fear and adrenaline. 3 riders approached the homestead from the south, moving with the purposeful confidence of men who knew exactly where they were going. Even at a distance, she could see that they were well armed and well mounted, their horses showing the quality that came with money and careful breeding. They dismounted near the cabin and began a systematic search of the property, examining the well, the barn, and the surrounding area with the thoroughness of professional investigators. From her hiding place, Delaney watched as the men methodically explored every visible inch of the homestead. They seemed particularly interested in the area around the well and the dry creek bed, though they showed no sign of having discovered the silver vein. After nearly an hour of searching, they remounted and rode away toward the northeast, leaving behind only hoofprints and a lingering sense of menace. That evening, back in her room at the boarding house, Delaney struggled to make sense of what she had witnessed. Who were the mysterious riders, and what were they looking for? How had they known to search Uncle Jeremiah's property so thoroughly? And most importantly, how long did she have before others discovered what she had found? She spread the surveyor's map on her small table and studied it by candlelight, trying to understand all its markings and notations. The document was far more complex than she had initially realized, containing not just boundary lines and mining claims, but detailed geological surveys and what appeared to be coded references to specific locations and landmarks. One notation in particular caught her attention, a small symbol near the area where she had found the silver, accompanied by the words, "Morrison's Cash Guardian's Price." The meaning was unclear, but the reference to a cache suggested that Black Pete Morrison might have hidden something more than just mining claims in the area. And the phrase, "Guardian's Price," carried ominous implications about the cost of protecting such secrets. As she prepared for bed, Delaney made several important decisions. First, she would need to confide in someone she trusted, because the magnitude of her discovery was too great to handle alone. Second, she would need to research the legal requirements for filing mining claims and establishing clear title to mineral rights. And third, she would need to find out everything she could about Black Pete Morrison and what had really happened to him in 1853. The person she trusted most was Colt Ramirez, whose steady demeanor and obvious integrity made him the logical choice for a confidant. But even that decision carried risks. Once she shared her secret, there would be no taking it back, and the knowledge would put both of them in potential danger. Sleep came slowly that night, filled with dreams of glittering silver and shadowy riders, of mysterious maps and ancient curses. But beneath the excitement and fear, Delaney felt a growing sense of purpose and determination. She had been given an extraordinary opportunity, and she was not going to let fear or uncertainty cause her to waste it. Whatever dangers lay ahead, she would face them with the same courage and resilience that had carried her through all the previous challenges of her life. The poor cowgirl was about to become a player in a much larger and more dangerous game, but she was no longer the naive young woman who had inherited a seemingly worthless homestead just a week ago. She was learning to think like a businesswoman, to plan like a strategist, and to prepare for the battles that lay ahead. The decision to confide in Colt Ramirez came easier than Delaney had expected. On a Tuesday morning, she approached his blacksmith shop, carrying a small leather pouch that contained her most promising ore samples. The rhythmic hammering stopped as she entered, and Colt looked up from the horseshoe he was shaping, sweat beading on his forehead despite the early hour. "Morning, Delaney," he said, setting down his hammer and wiping his hands on his leather apron. "You look like you've got something weighing on your mind." "I do," she replied, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "I need to show you something, but I need your word that what I'm about to share stays between us." Colt's expression grew serious. "You have it." Without another word, Delaney opened the leather pouch and poured the raw silver ore onto his workbench. The samples caught the morning light streaming through the shop windows, throwing back reflections that made the metal seem almost alive. Colt stared at the ore for a long moment, then picked up one of the larger pieces and examined it carefully. "Sweet Mother of God," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Where did you find this?" "Uncle Jeremiah's property," Delaney replied. "There's a vein in the old creek bed that looks like it runs for miles underground. This isn't just a pocket. Colt, it's a lode that could be worth millions." Colt set down the ore sample and looked at her with a mixture of amazement and concern. "Do you have any idea what this means? If word gets out about a strike this rich, you'll have every prospector, claim jumper, and fortune hunter in the territory descending on that homestead." "I know," Delaney said. "That's why I'm keeping it quiet until I can figure out how to protect myself legally. But I can't do this alone, Colt. I need someone I can trust, and you're the only person in Dead Rock Gulch who's ever treated me with genuine respect." The blacksmith was quiet for several minutes, turning the ore samples over in his hands and studying them with the eye of someone who understood the value of precious metals. Finally, He looked up at her with a grave expression. "This explains why the Blackwoods are so interested in buying your land," he said. "They must know about the silver, or at least suspect it exists." "How could they know?" Delaney asked. "I only discovered it a week ago." "These old mining families have long memories," Colt replied. "Stories get passed down through generations, maps get inherited, and sometimes what looks like folklore turns out to be historical fact. If Black Pete Morrison really did file claims on that land back in the 50s, there might be records somewhere that the Blackwoods have access to." Delaney pulled out the surveyor's map she had found beneath Uncle Jeremiah's floorboards, spreading it across the workbench beside the ore samples. Colt studied the document carefully, his finger tracing the boundary lines and mineral notations with growing interest. "This is Morrison's original survey," he said finally. "Look at these geological markers. Whoever drew this map knew exactly what he was looking for, and these coded references suggest there might be more than just silver on your property." "What do you mean?" Delaney asked. Colt pointed to several symbols scattered across the map. "These markings usually indicate different types of mineral deposits: silver, gold, copper maybe, even gemstones. Your uncle's homestead might be sitting on top of one of the richest mineral fields in the Arizona Territory." The magnitude of her discovery was beginning to overwhelm Delaney. She had thought finding the silver vein was extraordinary enough, but the possibility of multiple deposits made her feel dizzy with excitement and terror in equal measure. "What do I do now?" she asked. "How do I protect myself and my claim?" "First, we need to get these samples properly assayed," Colt said. "I know a man in Tucson who can tell us exactly what you're dealing with: purity, value, potential yield. But we'll need to be discreet about it. If word leaks out before you can establish legal title, you could lose everything to claim jumpers or corrupt officials." "Can you arrange it?" Delaney asked. "I can," Colt replied, "but you'll need to trust me completely. The man I'm thinking of is absolutely reliable, but the trip to Tucson will take several days, and you'll need to stay away from the homestead while I'm gone. Any unusual activity out there could draw unwanted attention." Delaney nodded, understanding the wisdom of his advice, even though the idea of staying away from her property made her nervous. "What about filing mining claims? How do I make sure my rights are protected legally?" "That's more complicated," Colt admitted. "Mining law in the territories is still evolving, and there are a lot of ways for someone with money and influence to challenge a claim. You'll need to file with the territorial government in Phoenix, but you'll also need to establish continuous possession and show evidence of active mining operations." "Continuous possession," Delaney repeated. "You'll need to be living on the property and actively working the claim," Colt explained. "The law requires miners to demonstrate ongoing development of their discoveries, not just file paperwork and walk away. It's designed to prevent speculation and encourage actual resource extraction." The implications of this requirement hit Delaney like a physical blow. Living alone on the remote homestead would make her incredibly vulnerable to the kind of dangerous men who were drawn to rich mining strikes. But without establishing continuous possession, her legal claim to the silver would be worthless. "I can't live out there alone," she said quietly. "Not with what's at stake." "You won't be alone," Colt replied, his voice carrying a note of quiet determination. "If you're willing to trust me, I'll help you establish and protect your claim. I've got some experience with mining operations, and I know how to handle myself in difficult situations." Delaney looked at him carefully, seeing something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a hardness that spoke of experiences beyond the peaceful routine of blacksmithing in a small territorial town. "What kind of experience?" she asked. "The kind that taught me how to stay alive in places where the law is whatever the strongest man says it is," Colt replied evasively. "Let's just say I wasn't always a blacksmith, and leave it at that for now." The revelation that Colt had a mysterious past should have concerned her, but instead it brought a sense of relief. If she was going to face the dangers that came with extraordinary wealth, she would need someone with more than ordinary skills to help her survive. "All right," she said finally. "I'm trusting you with my life and my future. Don't make me regret it." You won't, Colt promised, beginning to carefully wrap the ore samples in oiled cloth. I'll leave for Tucson tomorrow morning and be back within a week. While I'm gone, you need to act completely normal about your usual routine. Don't make any changes that might attract attention, and don't go near the homestead. What about the riders I saw? Delaney asked. Someone's already watching the property. Colt's expression darkened. Then we're running out of time. The longer we wait to establish your legal claim, the more vulnerable you become to theft or violence. When I get back from Tucson, we'll need to move fast. That evening, as Delaney lay in her narrow bed listening to the familiar sounds of the boarding house settling into sleep, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just 2 weeks. The poor cowgirl who had inherited a worthless homestead was now the secret owner of what might be one of the richest mineral deposits in the American West. But with that fortune came dangers she was only beginning to understand. The leather pouch containing her remaining ore samples lay hidden beneath her mattress, its contents representing both her salvation and her potential doom. In trusting Colt Ramirez with her secret, she had taken the first step toward claiming her inheritance. But she had also crossed a line from which there could be no return. Tomorrow, Colt would begin the journey to Tucson that would determine the true value of her discovery. And when he returned, they would begin the dangerous process of turning a poor cowgirl's secret into a legally protected fortune. The silver beneath the desert floor was about to change more than just Delaney's life. It was about to transform the entire balance of power in Dead Rock Gulch and the surrounding territory. As sleep finally claimed her, Delaney's dreams were filled with images of glittering ore veins and legal documents, of trusted allies and shadowy enemies, of a future that promised either extraordinary prosperity or violent death. The game for control of the McGraw silver had begun, though most of the players didn't even know they were sitting at the table yet. The week of Colt's absence passed with agonizing slowness. Delaney threw herself into her usual routine with forced normalcy, but every sound made her jump. Every unexpected visitor to the boarding house sent her pulse racing. She mended clothes with hands that trembled slightly, helped Mrs. Patterson with her weekly baking, and assisted at Henderson's general store, all while fighting the constant urge to ride out to the homestead and check on her precious discovery. On the 5th day of Colt's journey, Mayor Cornelius Blackwood paid her an unexpected visit at the boarding house. Delaney was sitting on the front porch, ostensibly reading a 3-week-old newspaper from Phoenix, when the mayor's polished carriage pulled up to the front gate. He climbed down with the careful dignity of a man conscious of his importance, adjusting his expensive coat and checking his pocket watch before approaching. "Miss McGraw," he said formally, removing his hat, "I hope I'm not interrupting your leisure." "Not at all, Mr. Blackwood," Delaney replied, setting aside the newspaper. "What brings you by?" "A matter of business, actually," the mayor said, settling into the chair beside her without invitation. "I've been giving considerable thought to your situation, a young woman alone, trying to make something of that remote property. It's a dangerous undertaking, and I'd like to make you a more generous offer for the land." Delaney kept her expression neutral, despite the warning bells ringing in her mind. "I wasn't aware that I'd received a previous offer, sir." "Perhaps offer is too strong a word," Blackwood conceded with a slight smile. "But I believe my nephew Marcus mentioned our interest in acquiring the property. I'm prepared to increase our proposal significantly, say $500 for the entire homestead and all mineral rights." $500 was more money than Delaney had ever possessed at one time, enough to buy a comfortable house in town and live modestly for several years. But compared to the potential value of her silver discovery, it was insulting. The fact that Blackwood was raising his offer without any apparent reason confirmed her suspicions that he knew more about her property than he was admitting. "That's quite generous," she said carefully, "but I'm still getting to know the land. It seems premature to make such a significant decision." Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I understand your reluctance, my dear, but I feel obligated to warn you about the dangers of that particular piece of territory. The desert can be unforgiving to those who don't understand its ways, and that area has a particularly troublesome history. What kind of history? Delaney asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Well, there's the matter of Black Pete Morrison, of course, Blackwood said, his tone suggesting he was sharing common knowledge. A dangerous man who caused considerable trouble in the territory before he disappeared. Some say he buried stolen gold somewhere in those hills, and treasure hunters have been sniffing around the area for decades. Not the sort of neighbors a respectable young woman wants to attract. The mayor's warning contained enough truth to be believable, but Delaney sensed there was more to the story. "Did you know him personally?" she asked. "Black Pete Morrison, I mean." "Heavens no," Blackwood replied quickly. "That was before my time in the territory, but the stories have been passed down, and they're not pleasant ones. The man was a killer and a thief, and some folks believe his spirit still haunts that land. Foolish superstition, of course, but it makes the property difficult to develop or sell." "Yet you're willing to purchase it," Delaney observed. "The Blackwood family has extensive experience dealing with challenging properties," the mayor said smoothly. "We have the resources to handle whatever difficulties might arise. A young woman living alone, however, would be much more vulnerable to the sort of troubles that land attracts." After Blackwood left, Delaney sat on the porch for a long time, thinking about the implications of his visit. The mayor's increased offer and his detailed knowledge of Black Pete Morrison's history suggested that the Blackwood family had been planning to acquire her property long before Uncle Jeremiah's death. The question was whether they knew about the silver specifically, or whether they were acting on suspicions and old stories. 2 days later, Colt returned from Tucson with news that confirmed her wildest hopes and deepest fears. They met after dark in his blacksmith shop, the forge cold and the building empty, except for the two of them. Colt spread a collection of official documents across his workbench, his expression grave despite the extraordinary news he carried. "The assayer's report is beyond anything I expected," he began, pulling out a detailed analysis written on official letterhead. "Your ore samples average 87% pure silver, with some pieces testing at over 90%. The assayer estimates that even a conservative mining operation could extract silver worth at least $20 million from what you've shown him, and he believes the actual yield could be much higher." Delaney felt the world tilt around her as the magnitude of her wealth became real. $20 million was a fortune beyond imagination, enough to buy entire counties, enough to make her one of the wealthiest individuals in the American West. "But that's not all," Colt continued, pulling out another document. "I also had him analyze some of the unusual markings on your surveyor's map. According to his geological expertise, your property likely contains not just silver, but significant deposits of gold, copper, and possibly even gemstones. He thinks the total value of all mineral deposits could exceed $100 million. The figure was so staggering that Delaney couldn't quite process it. She had gone from inheriting a worthless homestead to discovering what might be the richest mineral field in the American West. But even as excitement flooded through her, she realized that such wealth would make her a target for every dangerous individual within 1,000 miles. "There's more," Colt said, his voice carrying a note of warning. "While I was in Tucson, I did some research into mining law and territorial records. Your Uncle Jeremiah filed very specific mineral rights claims with the territorial government 3 years ago, covering exactly the area where you found the silver. He never developed the claims, but he established clear legal title to all mineral deposits on the property." "So my inheritance is legally protected?" Delaney asked hopefully. "Yes and no," Colt replied. "The mineral rights are legally yours, but only if you can maintain continuous possession and show active development within 6 months of filing. If someone challenges your claim and can prove you've abandoned the property, they can file a competing claim that could override yours." Delaney understood the implications immediately. She would need to establish a permanent residence at the homestead and begin actual mining operations within 6 months, or risk losing everything to claim jumpers. But living alone on the remote property would make her an easy target for anyone willing to use violence to steal her fortune. I also learned something else while I was in Tucson, Colt said, producing one final document. The territorial records show that the Blackwood family has been quietly acquiring mineral rights throughout this region for the past 5 years. They now control mining claims on thousands of acres surrounding your property, but your uncle's homestead sits right in the middle of their holdings like an island. The pattern was becoming clear. The Blackwoods had somehow learned about the mineral wealth in the region and had been systematically acquiring land and mining rights in preparation for large-scale extraction operations. Uncle Jeremiah's property was the last piece they needed to complete their monopoly, which explained their eagerness to buy land they publicly dismissed as worthless. "They're not going to give up easily," Delaney said quietly. "No, they're not," Colt agreed, "and they have the resources to make your life very difficult if you stand in their way. But there's something else you need to know, something I discovered about the mining claim certificate itself." Colt pulled out the final document, an official certificate bearing the territorial seal and signed by government officials in Phoenix. The paper was crisp and new, with elaborate borders and formal language that established Delaney's legal right to extract minerals from her inherited property. "When your uncle filed these claims, he did something very clever," Colt explained, pointing to specific clauses in the legal text. "He didn't just file for standard mining right, she filed for exclusive mineral extraction privileges that can't be challenged by adjacent landowners or corporate entities. It's a special classification that's rarely granted, but it makes your claim virtually unassailable in court." "How did he manage that?" Delaney asked, studying the impressive document. "Your uncle had connections I didn't know about," Colt replied. "The territorial mining commissioner who signed this certificate is a man named William Harrison, and according to the records I found, he and Jeremiah McGraw served together in the Mexican War 20 years ago. Sometimes old military friendships carry more weight than money when it comes to government favors." The mining claim certificate represented more than just legal protection. It was proof that Uncle Jeremiah had been planning for this moment for years, carefully laying the groundwork to ensure that his niece would inherit not just land, but legally protected mineral rights that couldn't be stolen through corporate manipulation or political corruption. "There's one more thing," Colt said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "While I was researching territorial records, I found references to Black Pete Morrison that don't match the stories people tell around here. According to official documents, Morrison wasn't just a prospector, he was a federal agent investigating illegal mining operations and claim jumping schemes in the 1850s. This revelation hit Delaney like a physical blow. If Black Pete Morrison had been a federal agent rather than an outlaw, it meant that everything she had heard about him was deliberately false. Someone had been spreading lies about Morrison's identity for decades, probably to discourage investigation of the area where he had disappeared. "So he didn't bury stolen gold," Delaney said, her mind racing. "He was investigating the people who were stealing mining claims. And someone killed him for it," Colt concluded grimly, "which means the same people who eliminated a federal agent 30 years ago might be willing to eliminate anyone else who threatens their interests today." The weight of this knowledge settled over Delaney like a heavy blanket. She wasn't just fighting for her inheritances, was potentially facing the same enemies who had murdered a federal investigator and covered up their crime for 3 decades. The stakes were higher than she had imagined, and the dangers more immediate than she had feared. The discovery that changed everything came 3 days later, hidden behind a loose floorboard that Delaney had missed during her previous searches of Uncle Jeremiah's cabin. She had returned to the homestead with Colt to begin the process of establishing permanent residence, bringing supplies and tools for what they both knew would be a dangerous but necessary undertaking. As Colt worked outside, reinforcing the barn and setting up defensive positions around the property, Delaney conducted a final, methodical search of the cabin's interior. She was examining the area near the fireplace when her foot hit a section of flooring that sounded different from the rest, hollow, rather than solid, with a slight give that suggested empty space beneath. Prying up the loose boards revealed a hidden compartment that Uncle Jeremiah had constructed with the skill of a master carpenter. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas and protected from moisture and insects, lay a leather-bound journal whose pages contained the answers to questions that had been troubling her for weeks. The journal was written in Uncle Jeremiah's careful handwriting, beginning with entries dated 3 years earlier and continuing almost until the time of his death. As Delaney read, the full scope of her inheritance and the dangers it represented became devastatingly clear. March 15, 1884, received word today that the territorial mining inspector will be investigating claims in our region next month. Must ensure that our paperwork is in perfect order before his arrival. The Blackwood family has been asking too many questions about mineral surveys, and I suspect they know more than they're revealing about the deposits on McGraw land. April 2, 1884 met with William Harrison in Phoenix. He remembers our service together in Mexico and agrees that Delaney deserves protection from the vultures who would steal her birthright. The special mineral rights classification should prevent any legal challenges to her claim, but only if she can maintain continuous possession. April 20, 1884. Found evidence that confirms my worst suspicions. The Blackwoods have been systematically acquiring mineral rights throughout the region based on geological surveys that should not exist. Someone has been conducting unauthorized mineral assessments on private property, probably using information stolen from territorial archives. May 8, 1884, discovered the truth about Peter Morrison. He wasn't the outlaw that local stories claim. He was a federal investigator sent to expose illegal mining operations in the 1850s. His real name was Peter Malcolm Morrison, and he was getting close to uncovering a conspiracy involving territorial officials and eastern mining interests before he disappeared. May 12, 1884, found Morrison's personal effects hidden in a cave near the silver deposit. Among them was a detailed report documenting illegal claim-jumping schemes and political corruption that he was preparing to send to Washington. The report named specific individuals who were still alive when Morrison disappeared, including the grandfather of the current mayor. The revelation that Uncle Jeremiah had discovered Peter Morrison's hidden report sent chills through Delaney. If Morrison had documented political corruption involving the Blackwood family's ancestors, it would explain both their current interest in controlling the region's mineral wealth and their determination to prevent anyone from investigating too closely. June 3, 1884. The silver deposit is larger than I initially estimated. Conservative calculations suggest the lode contains silver worth at least $50 million, but the true value could be twice that amount. Have decided not to exploit the discovery during my lifetime, too dangerous for an old man living alone. Will leave everything to Delaney and pray that she has the courage and wisdom to handle such a burden. August 15, 1884. Someone has been watching the homestead, found evidence of riders conducting surveillance from the ridge overlooking the property. Have taken precautions to hide all evidence of the mineral deposits, but fear that our activities have not gone unnoticed. October 30, 1884 met secretly with Marshal Torres from the territorial capital. He confirms that federal authorities are still interested in the Morrison case and would welcome new evidence. Have arranged for a coded message system in case something happens to me before Delaney claims her inheritance. December 1, 1884. Health failing more rapidly than expected. Have hidden this journal and Morrison's report where Delaney will find them if she looks carefully. Pray that she will understand the magnitude of what she's inheriting and take appropriate precautions to protect herself. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks before Uncle Jeremiah's death, written in handwriting that showed the tremor of advancing illness. January 10, 1885. If Delaney is reading this, then I am gone, and she has inherited both a great fortune and a deadly secret. The silver beneath McGraw land is worth more than most people see in a lifetime, but it has already cost Peter Morrison his life, and may cost her hers if she is not careful. Trust, no one in Dead Rock Gulch except the blacksmith Colt Ramirez is not what he appears to be, but his intentions toward her are honorable. The truth about Morrison is hidden in the cave where I found his effects. May God protect her from the forces that will try to steal her birthright. Delaney set down the journal with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the weight of her uncle's revelations. Not only had he known about the silver for years, but he had also uncovered evidence of corruption and murder that reached back decades. Most significantly, he had specifically mentioned Colt Ramirez as someone she could trust, suggesting that her uncle had known more about the blacksmith's background than he had ever revealed. When Colt returned to the cabin that evening, Delaney showed him the journal and watched his expression change as he read Uncle Jeremiah's entries. When he reached the final passage mentioning his name, he looked up at her with something approaching resignation. "Your uncle was more perceptive than I gave him credit for," Colt said quietly. "He figured out who I really am." "And who are you really?" Delaney asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Colt was silent for a long moment, staring out the cabin window at the desert landscape bathed in moonlight. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of long-held secrets. "My name is Colt Ramirez, and I am a blacksmith," he said carefully. "But I'm also a deputy U.S. Marshal, assigned to investigate territorial corruption and unsolved federal crimes. I've been working undercover in Dead Rock Gulch for 2 years, trying to develop evidence against the Blackwood family and their associates." The revelation should have shocked her, but instead Delaney felt a sense of relief. Uncle Jeremiah's endorsement of Colt's character, combined with her own instincts about his integrity, had prepared her for something like this. "So you've been investigating the Blackwoods all along," she said. "Among others," Colt confirmed. "The territorial government suspects that there's been a systematic conspiracy to steal mineral rights from legitimate claimants, but proving it has been difficult. The Blackwoods are careful, and they have allies in high places who protect them from official scrutiny." "What about Peter Morrison's murder?" Delaney asked. "That case has never been officially closed," Colt replied. "If your uncle really found Morrison's original report, it could provide the evidence we need to reopen the investigation and bring charges against everyone involved in the conspiracy." Delaney understood that she was now at the center of something much larger than her personal inheritance. The silver beneath her land was valuable beyond imagination, but the information Uncle Jeremiah had uncovered might be even more precious to the cause of justice. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we find Morrison's hidden report," Colt said with quiet determination, "and then we make sure that everyone responsible for his death faces the consequences they've been avoiding for 30 years. As they prepared for sleep in the small cabin, Delaney reflected on how completely her life had been transformed in just 3 weeks. She had inherited not just a silver mine worth millions, but also the responsibility to expose a decades-old conspiracy and bring justice to a murdered federal agent. The poor cowgirl, who had been mocked by the townspeople of Dead Rock Gulch, was about to become the key witness in one of the most significant criminal cases in territorial history. The cave where Uncle Jeremiah had discovered Peter Morrison's personal effects lay hidden in a rocky outcropping 3 miles northeast of the Homestead, concealed behind a tangle of Palo Verde trees and accessible only through a narrow passage that required crawling on hands and knees. Delaney and Colt found it on their second day of searching, guided by cryptic references in the journal and Colt's knowledge of how federal agents typically concealed evidence caches. The entrance was so well disguised that they might have missed it entirely, if not for a small cairn of stacked stones that Uncle Jeremiah had built as a marker. Inside, the cave opened into a natural chamber, large enough for 2 people to stand upright, its walls bearing the scorch marks of old campfires and its floor covered with the debris of decades. But it was what they found hidden in a crevice at the back of the cave that changed everything they thought they knew about Peter Morrison's disappearance and the conspiracy surrounding Delaney's inheritance. The cache contained a leather saddlebag that had been carefully sealed against moisture and insects, its contents preserved in remarkable condition despite 30 years in the desert. Inside were Morrison's personal effects: a badge identifying him as a federal investigator, correspondence from his superiors in Washington, and most significantly, a detailed report documenting corruption that reached far beyond the territorial government. But tucked beneath Morrison's official papers was something that neither Delaney nor Colt had expected to find: a collection of wanted posters bearing the image and description of a notorious outlaw named Black Pete. Morrison, along with documentation proving that Peter Malcolm Morrison, the federal agent, had been using the outlaw's identity as cover for his investigation. He was working undercover, Colt said, studying the wanted posters by lamplight. The real Black Pete Morrison was a known criminal who had died in a Mexican prison 2 years before our Peter Morrison arrived in the territory. The federal agent took his identity and let people believe he was the outlaw to throw off suspicion while he investigated the corruption. The revelation explained why stories about Black Pete Morrison had been so contradictory and why the Blackwood family had been so eager to perpetuate the legend of buried treasure. If people believed that a dangerous outlaw had hidden stolen gold in the area, they would be less likely to investigate the real reason for his disappearance. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. Hidden beneath the wanted posters was a document that made Delaney's hands shake as she read it. A detailed geological survey conducted by Eastern mining interests in 1852, complete with assay reports and mineral estimates that accurately identified the silver deposits beneath what would later become Uncle Jeremiah's homestead. This survey predates Morrison's investigation by a year, Delaney said, her voice barely above a whisper. Someone knew about the silver long before he started looking into the corruption. Colt examined the geological survey with growing amazement. This explains everything. The conspiracy wasn't just about stealing individual mining. Claims it was about monopolizing an entire region based on secret geological knowledge. Someone conducted unauthorized mineral surveys throughout the territory and then used that information to systematically acquire the most valuable properties. The survey bore the seal of a company called Eastern Mining Consortium, and listed among its directors were names that Delaney recognized from Uncle Jeremiah's journal, including Cornelius Blackwood Sr., the current mayor's grandfather, and several other prominent territorial families. "My God," Colt breathed, reading over her shoulder. "This survey shows deposits worth hundreds of millions of dollars spread across thousands of acres." If they had succeeded in acquiring all the land identified in this report, they would have controlled the largest mineral empire in the American West. But it was the final document in Morrison's cache that revealed the true magnitude of the conspiracy: a detailed map showing not just the mineral deposits, but a complex network of illegal land acquisitions, forged documents, and murdered or intimidated claimants that stretched across 3 territories. Morrison wasn't just investigating claim jumping, Delaney realized. He was uncovering a systematic campaign to steal an entire region's mineral wealth through fraud and violence. The map showed dozens of properties where legitimate claimants had died under suspicious circumstances or disappeared entirely. Their land subsequently acquired by companies connected to the Eastern Mining Consortium. The pattern was clear and horrifying. Anyone who stood in the way of the conspiracy's goals was eliminated, and their deaths were covered up or attributed to the dangers of frontier life. "This is why they killed him," Colt said grimly. Morrison had uncovered evidence that could have destroyed the most powerful mining families in the West and sent dozens of people to prison or the gallows. Among the documented cases was one that made Delaney's blood run cold: the mysterious death of her own parents during the influenza outbreak that had swept through the territory 12 years earlier. According to Morrison's notes, Thomas and Mary McGraw had filed mineral rights claims on their family farm just weeks before they became ill, claims that were quietly transferred to Blackwood associates after their deaths. "They killed my parents," Delaney whispered, the words barely audible, even in the silence of the cave. "The influenza was just a convenient cover story." Colt's face was grim as he studied Morrison's documentation. The timing is too convenient to be coincidental. Your parents filed mineral claims, and within a month they were dead from a disease that somehow didn't affect any of their neighbors. The realization that her parents had been murdered by the same conspiracy that now threatened her own life filled Delaney with a cold rage that cut through her fear like a blade. She had spent 12 years believing that influenza had taken the two people she loved most in the world, never suspecting that they had been killed to prevent them from claiming their rightful inheritance. "There's more," Colt said, pulling out the final document from Morrison's cache. "Look at this list of current targets, people. The conspiracy planned to eliminate or intimidate into selling their property." The list, dated just days before Morrison's disappearance, contained a dozen names of property owners whose land contained significant mineral deposits. At the top of the list, circled in red ink, was the name Jeremiah McGraw Limonate before he can file formal claims. Uncle Jeremiah knew he was in danger, Delaney realized. That's why he waited so long to file his mineral rights claims, and why he made sure they were legally unassailable before he did. And that's why he chose to live in poverty rather than exploit the silver, Colt added. He knew that any attempt to develop the deposits would sign his death warrant. As they carefully repacked Morrison's evidence and prepared to leave the cave, Delaney felt the weight of 30 years of injustice settling on her shoulders. She was no longer just fighting for her inheritances, was carrying the responsibility to bring justice for her murdered parents, for Peter Morrison, and for dozens of other victims of the conspiracy that had controlled the territory's mineral wealth for decades. "What do we do now?" she asked as they emerged from the cave into the harsh desert sunlight. "Now we finish what Morrison started," Colt replied, his voice carrying the quiet determination of a man who had spent years preparing for this moment. "We gather the evidence, we build a case that can't be ignored or buried, and we make sure that everyone responsible for these crimes faces justice." But even as they rode back toward the homestead, with Morrison's evidence safely hidden in their saddlebags, Delaney knew that their enemies would not surrender without a fight. The Blackwood family and their associates had killed to protect their secrets before, and they would not hesitate to kill again to prevent their exposure. The poor cowgirl who had inherited a desert homestead had become the most dangerous person in the Arizona territory, not because of the silver beneath her land, but because of the evidence she now carried that could destroy the most powerful criminal conspiracy in the American West. The revelation of Colt's true identity as Deputy U.S. Marshal Colt Ramirez came 3 days after their discovery of Morrison's evidence cache, and it changed everything about their relationship and their strategy for exposing the conspiracy. Delaney found his federal marshal's badge hidden beneath a false bottom in his blacksmith's tool chest, along with official correspondence that revealed the full scope of his undercover investigation. The badge was silver, tarnished with age and wear, its surface bearing the scratches and dents that spoke of years in active service. Attached to it was a letter from the U.S. Marshal's office in Denver, dated 2 years earlier, authorizing Deputy Marshal Ramirez to investigate territorial corruption using whatever methods and cover identity he deemed necessary. "You've been lying to me from the beginning," Delaney said when she confronted him that evening, her voice carrying a mixture of hurt and anger that surprised her with its intensity. "I've been protecting you from the beginning," Colt replied quietly, making no attempt to deny or justify his deception. "Everything I told you about my feelings and my commitment to helping you was true. The only thing I kept hidden was my official capacity to investigate the crimes you've uncovered." "But you knew about my parents," Delaney accused. "You knew they were murdered, and you let me believe for weeks that they died of influenza." Colt's expression was pained as he met her eyes. "I suspected, but I couldn't prove it without Morrison's evidence. And I couldn't risk exposing my investigation before we had enough documentation to bring charges that would stick in federal court." The betrayal cut deep, not because of what Colt had done, but because of what his deception meant about the foundation of their relationship. Everything she had felt for him, the growing trust, the deepening affection, the sense of partnership in facing danger together now, seemed tainted by the knowledge that he had been working under false pretenses. "How do I know anything between us is real?" she asked, hating the vulnerability in her voice. "Because this is real," Colt said, pulling out a collection of telegrams from his correspondence file. "These are communications I've sent to my superiors over the past month, recommending that you be offered federal protection and official status as a witness in the investigation. I've been fighting to get you the resources and legal support you need, even though it meant risking exposure of my own cover." Delaney read the telegrams with growing amazement. Colt had been advocating for her interests at the federal level, using his official position to ensure that she would be protected from retaliation once the conspiracy was exposed. More than that, he had recommended that she be compensated for her role in uncovering evidence of federal crimes, suggesting that the government might be willing to purchase mineral rights to her property at fair market value to prevent it from falling into corrupt hands. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, some of her anger fading as she understood the scope of his efforts on her behalf. "Because I needed you to make your own decisions based on what you believed was right, not because a federal marshal was telling you what to do," Colt replied. "And because I needed to be sure that you could be trusted with information that could get both of us killed if it fell into the wrong hands." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of riders approaching the homestead under cover of darkness. Colt immediately extinguished their lamp and moved to the window, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun he wore beneath his coat. Through the darkness, they could see at least 6 mounted figures surrounding the cabin, their horses moving with the disciplined precision of a military unit. "Federal marshals," Colt said after studying their formation. "I recognize the tactical approach. My backup has finally arrived." The lead rider dismounted and approached the cabin cautiously, calling out in a voice that carried the authority of federal law enforcement. "Deputy Marshal Ramirez, this is Marshal James Torres from the Denver office. Please identify yourself and confirm your status." Colt stepped onto the cabin's small porch, his badge visible in the moonlight. "Ramirez here, Marshal Torres. My investigation is complete, and we have the evidence we need to proceed with arrests and prosecutions." Torres was a man in his 50s, weathered by years of frontier law enforcement, but carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced down the worst criminals the West had to offer. He dismounted and approached the cabin with 2 of his deputies, while the others maintained watch positions around the property. "Miss McGraw," Torres said formally, removing his hat as he entered the cabin. "I understand you've been instrumental in uncovering evidence of federal crimes. The government is grateful for your cooperation and prepared to offer you full protection during the prosecution phase of this investigation." "What exactly does that mean?" Delaney asked, still processing the rapid transformation of her situation from isolated homesteader to federal witness. "It means that as of tonight, you're under the protection of the U.S. Marshals Service," Torres replied. "We have warrants for the arrest of Cornelius Blackwood, Marcus Blackwood, and 17 other individuals associated with the conspiracy that killed Peter Morrison and has been systematically stealing mineral rights throughout the territory." The marshal spread a collection of legal documents across Uncle Jeremiah's table, each one bearing official seals and signatures that represented the full weight of federal authority. The warrants detailed specific charges ranging from murder and conspiracy to mail fraud and violation of federal mining laws. "The evidence you and Deputy Marshal Ramirez have uncovered is sufficient to bring charges that could result in life imprisonment or execution for the primary conspirators," Torres continued. "But we need your testimony to establish the full scope of the conspiracy and to ensure that all the evidence is properly authenticated for trial." "What about my mineral rights?" Delaney asked, concerned that federal involvement might complicate her claim to the silver deposits. "Your rights are fully protected under federal law," Torres assured her. "In fact, the government is prepared to offer you a substantial sum for exclusive access to your property during the investigation and trial. The mineral deposits will remain yours, but we'll need to conduct our own surveys and assessments to determine their role in the conspiracy." As the marshals established security around the homestead and began the process of documenting the evidence Delaney and Colt had uncovered, the magnitude of what they were attempting began to sink in. They were preparing to take down one of the most powerful criminal conspiracies in the American West, a network of corruption that had operated with impunity for decades. "The arrests will begin tomorrow morning," Torres explained. "We're coordinating with federal authorities in Phoenix and Tucson to ensure that all the conspirators are taken into custody simultaneously. If we give them time to communicate with each other or destroy evidence, some of them might escape justice." "Will I be safe?" Delaney asked, thinking about the violent men who had killed her parents and Peter Morrison. "You'll have federal protection for as long as necessary," Torres promised. "But I won't lie to you. These are dangerous people with resources and connections. Until they're all behind bars, you'll need to be extremely careful about who you trust and where you go." That night, as federal marshals stood guard around the homestead and prepared for the largest law enforcement operation in territorial history, Delaney lay awake thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 weeks ago, she had been a poor cowgirl mocked by the townspeople of Dead Rock Gulch. Now she was the key witness in a federal investigation, the owner of mineral rights worth millions of dollars, and the person whose testimony would determine whether justice would finally be served for decades of corruption and murder. But more than anything, she thought about her parents and Uncle Jeremiah, and about Peter Morrison, whose courage in investigating the conspiracy had cost him his life, but whose evidence would finally expose the truth. Tomorrow, the reckoning would begin, and the poor cowgirl who had inherited a desert homestead would help bring down the most powerful criminal family in the Arizona territory. The silver beneath her land had always been valuable, but the justice it would help secure was worth far more than any amount of precious metal. The attack came at dawn, just as the federal marshals were preparing to ride into Dead Rock Gulch to begin their arrests. Delaney was standing at the cabin window, watching the sunrise paint the desert mountains in shades of gold and crimson, when she saw the dust cloud rising from the southern approach to the homestead. The cloud was too large and moving too fast to be caused by anything other than a large group of armed riders moving at full gallop. "Marshal Torres," she called out, her voice cutting through the morning quiet. "We have company coming fast from the south." Torres and his deputies immediately took defensive positions around the homestead, their rifles ready and their movements betraying years of experience in frontier gunfights. Colt appeared at Delaney's side, pressing a loaded revolver into her hands with quiet instructions about how to use it if the situation turned desperate. "Stay low and stay behind cover," he said, his voice calm despite the approaching danger. "These men are going to be fighting for their lives, which makes them extremely dangerous." The riders resolved into a group of 12 men as they approached the homestead, all heavily armed and riding with the purposeful determination of a military assault. At their head rode Marcus Blackwood, his face twisted with rage and desperation, a rifle already in his hands and ready for use. "Federal marshals," Torres called out as the riders came within range. "You are ordered to halt and surrender your weapons immediately." The response was a volley of gunfire that shattered the morning silence and sent bullets whistling through the air around the cabin. One of the federal deputies cried out as a shot found its mark, spinning him around and dropping him behind the cover of a water trough. The battle for control of the McGraw homestead had begun. Delaney crouched behind the thick adobe walls of the cabin, her heart pounding with terror and adrenaline as bullets thudded into the walls around her. Through the window, she could see Colt and the federal marshals returning fire with deadly precision, their shots carefully aimed to disable rather than kill when possible. But the attacking riders showed no such restraint, firing rapidly and indiscriminately in their attempt to overwhelm the defenders. "They know we have the evidence," Torres shouted over the gunfire. "They're not trying to capture us, they're trying to eliminate everyone who can testify against them." The realization that the Blackwood family was willing to murder federal law enforcement officers to protect their secrets filled Delaney with a cold determination that surprised her. She had spent weeks afraid of these men, intimidated by their power and influence. But seeing them reduced to common criminals firing on representatives of federal authority made her understand that they were not invincible. They were desperate men fighting a losing battle against justice. From her position at the window, Delaney could see that the attackers had made a crucial tactical error. In their haste to reach the homestead before the arrests could begin, they had approached across open ground that left them exposed to defensive fire from the cabin and surrounding buildings. The federal marshals, trained in frontier warfare, were using the cover effectively to pick off the attackers one by one. Marcus Blackwood seemed to realize that his assault was failing, because he began shouting orders for his men to fall back and regroup. But as he turned his horse to retreat, one of the federal deputies sent a shot that brought down his mount, throwing the younger Blackwood to the ground with bone-jarring force. "Marcus Blackwood," Torres called out, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and assault on federal officers. Surrender now and order your men to lay down their weapons." Blackwood's response was to struggle to his feet and fire his rifle at the cabin, the bullet passing so close to Delaney's head that she could feel the wind of its passage. Without thinking, she raised her own weapon and returned fire, the heavy revolver bucking in her hands as the shot found its target. Marcus Blackwood stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder where Delaney's bullet had struck him, his rifle falling from suddenly nerveless fingers. The sight of their leader, wounded and disarmed, seemed to break the morale of the remaining attackers, who began throwing down their weapons and raising their hands in surrender. "Federal marshals," Torres shouted again. "Any man who continues fighting will be charged with treason against the United States government. Surrender now and receive fair treatment under the law." The gunfight, that had seemed destined to end in bloodshed and death, suddenly resolved into a scene of captivity and resignation. The surviving attackers dismounted and allowed themselves to be disarmed and restrained by the federal deputies, their faces showing the grim recognition that their conspiracy had finally been exposed and defeated. As the smoke cleared and the immediate danger passed, Delaney found herself standing in the doorway of Uncle Jeremiah's cabin, still holding the smoking revolver that had helped end the battle. The silver nugget she had been carrying as a talisman felt warm in her pocket, a tangible reminder of the fortune that had brought both danger and justice to her life. "Is it over?" she asked Colt, who was binding a minor wound on his arm where a bullet had grazed him during the fight. "The shooting is over," he replied, "but the legal battle is just beginning. We still need to arrest the rest of the conspiracy and make sure they face trial for their crimes." Marshal Torres approached them with a grim expression. "Miss McGraw, I'm afraid Marcus Blackwood's attack means that the other conspirators now know their organization has been exposed. Some of them may try to flee the territory before we can arrest them." "Then we need to move fast," Delaney said, surprised by her own determination. "These men killed my parents and Peter Morrison, and they've been stealing from honest people for decades. I won't let them escape justice because we were too slow to act." The transformation from frightened homesteader to determined advocate for justice felt natural and right, as if this had always been her true purpose. The silver beneath her land was valuable, but the opportunity to expose corruption and bring justice to the victims of the conspiracy was worth far more than any amount of precious metal. The final confrontation with Mayor Cornelius Blackwood took place in Dead Rock Gulch's town hall, where the elder Blackwood had barricaded himself with the last of his loyal supporters after learning of his nephew's capture and the failure of the attack on the homestead. When the federal marshals arrived in town that afternoon, they found the mayor had declared martial law and was attempting to rally the townspeople to resist what he called an illegal federal invasion. But the documents Delaney carried, the original land deed that Uncle Jeremiah had hidden in his effects, proved to be the final blow to the Blackwood family's decades of corruption. The deed, signed by territorial officials in 1852 and bearing official seals that could not be forged, established beyond any doubt that the McGraw family had owned clear title to their mineral-rich property for over 30 years. This deed predates every claim the Blackwoods have made to mineral rights in this region. Marshal Torres announced as he read the document aloud to the assembled townspeople. It proves that Jeremiah McGraw's property was legally acquired and properly registered, making any attempts to seize it through fraud or violence acts of federal crime. Mayor Blackwood emerged from the town hall with his remaining supporters, his face pale with the recognition that his family's criminal empire was finally collapsing. At 70 years old, he still carried himself with the dignity of a man accustomed to power, but his hands shook as he realized that the evidence against him was overwhelming and undeniable. "You have no authority here," he declared, though his voice lacked conviction. "This is a territorial matter, not a federal one. Murder of federal agents makes it a federal matter," Torres replied coldly. "As does conspiracy to defraud the United States government of mineral rights and tax revenues. Cornelius Blackwood, you are under arrest for crimes spanning 3 decades. The moment when the handcuffs closed around the mayor's wrists marked the end of an era in Dead Rock Gulch. For generations, the Blackwood family had controlled the town's politics and economy through intimidation and corruption. Their fall from power was so complete and sudden that many townspeople stood in stunned silence, unable to fully comprehend that the most powerful family in the territory had been reduced to common criminals in federal custody. But it was the discovery of additional evidence hidden in the mayor's private safe that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy's crimes. Among the documents Torres and his deputies seized were detailed records of every illegal land acquisition, every forged deed, and every murder committed to protect the family's interests over the past 30 years. "They kept records of everything," Colt said in amazement as he examined the seized documents. "Names, dates, methodsits, like they were proud of what they'd accomplished." "Arrogance," Torres replied grimly. "They never believed they could be caught, so they documented their crimes as if they were legitimate business transactions." Among the most damning evidence were correspondence files that revealed the conspiracy's connections to corrupt officials throughout the territorial government. The Blackwood family had been paying bribes to judges, territorial commissioners, and even federal appointees to ensure that their illegal activities remained protected from investigation. "This goes all the way to Washington," Torres said as he read through the correspondence. "Some of these officials will need to be arrested by federal authorities in the capital." For Delaney, the most emotionally significant discovery was a file containing detailed plans for the murder of her parents, complete with instructions for making their deaths appear to be the result of natural illness. The cold, businesslike tone of the documents describing how to eliminate Thomas and Mary McGraw filled her with a rage that took all her self-control to contain. "They planned it for months," she said, her voice barely steady as she read the horrifying details. "They researched my parents' habits, their health, even their relationships with neighbors. The influenza story was prepared in advance." Colt took the documents from her hands gently. "You don't need to read any more of this. We have enough evidence to ensure that everyone responsible faces justice." The townspeople of Dead Rock Gulch gradually began to understand that Delaney Rose McGraw, poor cowgirl they had mocked and dismissed for years, had been instrumental in exposing the criminal conspiracy that had controlled their community. As word spread about the silver discovery and the federal investigation, their attitude toward her transformed from condescension to amazement and respect. Mrs. Henderson approached Delaney outside the town hall as the federal marshals completed their arrests. "Miss McGraw, I owe you an apology. We all do. We never understood what you were facing or what you were fighting for." "You couldn't have known," Delaney replied graciously. "The Blackwoods were very good at hiding their crimes and making themselves appear respectable." "What will happen to the town now?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "With the Blackwood family gone, who will run things?" "The people will run things," Delaney said with quiet confidence. "The way it should have been all along." As the sun set over Dead Rock Gulch on that historic day, Delaney stood with Colt outside Uncle Jeremiah's old cabin, watching the federal marshals prepare to transport their prisoners to territorial court in Phoenix. The silver beneath her feet was still there, still valuable beyond imagination, but its discovery had accomplished something far more important than making her wealthy. "The truth is finally out," Colt said, taking her hand in his. Peter Morrison's murder has been solved. Your parents' deaths have been avenged, and one of the most corrupt organizations in the American West has been destroyed. And now, Delaney asked, looking out over the desert landscape that had hidden so many secrets for so many years. Now we build something better, Colt replied. A community based on justice and honesty instead of fear and corruption. A place where people like your parents can pursue their dreams without being murdered for their success. The original land deed that had proven her family's rightful ownership of the property felt solid and real in her hands, a tangible connection to the legacy her parents and Uncle Jeremiah had died protecting. The poor cowgirl, who had inherited a desert homestead, had become the instrument of justice for an entire territory, and the silver that had brought so much danger and death would now fund a better future for everyone. 6 months after the arrests that brought down the Blackwood conspiracy, Delaney Rose McGraw stood on the porch of her newly expanded homestead, wearing a silver-trimmed hat that caught the morning sunlight like captured starlight. The desert that had once seemed harsh and forbidding now felt like home in the truest sense of note, just a place where she lived, but a land she had fought for and earned through courage and determination. The silver mine that had started everything was now a legitimate operation, employing 30 men from Dead Rock Gulch and the surrounding territory. Under Delaney's direction, the McGraw Silver Company had become one of the most profitable and ethically managed mining operations in the American West, providing good wages and safe working conditions while generating the wealth that Uncle Jeremiah had always known lay beneath the desert floor. "Morning, Mrs. Ramirez," called out Tom Henderson, the mine foreman, as he approached the house with the daily production report. Another record day yesterday, nearly $2,000 worth of silver ore extracted, and we're still nowhere near the end of the main vein. Delaney smiled at the greeting, still adjusting to her married name after the wedding ceremony that had united her with Colt 3 months earlier. Marshal James Torres had performed the service, surrounded by federal agents, mine workers, and townspeople who had come to respect the woman who had transformed their community. "Thank you, Tom," she replied, accepting the production report. "And how are the safety conditions in the new shaft?" "Excellent, ma'am," Henderson assured her. "Your husband's engineering modifications have made it the safest mine in the territory. No accidents, no cave-ins, and the ventilation system he designed keeps the air clean even at the deepest levels." The transformation of Dead Rock Gulch had been as dramatic as Delaney's personal journey from poverty to prosperity. With the Blackwood family's corruption exposed and their illegal influence eliminated, the town had elected new leadership committed to honest government and community development. The silver mine's payroll had brought prosperity to dozens of families, and new businesses were opening monthly to serve the growing population. Elena Ramirez, now Elena Morrison after marrying Jake Morrison's eldest son, had opened a school that served children from throughout the region. Mrs. Patterson had expanded the boarding house into a proper hotel that accommodated the steady stream of legitimate investors and businessmen drawn by the area's newfound reputation for honest dealing. But perhaps the most significant change was the memorial that now stood in the town square, honoring Peter Morrison and the other victims of the conspiracy that had terrorized the territory for decades. The monument, carved from silver-bearing quartz extracted from Delaney's mine, bore the names of 37 people who had been murdered or disappeared because they had stood in the way of the Blackwood family's criminal empire. The federal prosecutor sent word that the trials are progressing well, Colt said, as he joined Delaney on the porch, wiping coal dust from his hands after a morning spent in the mine's equipment shed. Cornelius Blackwood and his associates will likely face life imprisonment, and several of the federal officials involved in the conspiracy have already been convicted. "Good," Delaney replied, though her satisfaction was tempered by the knowledge that no amount of justice could bring back the people who had died. "My parents and Uncle Jeremiah can finally rest in peace." The couple stood together in comfortable silence, watching the bustling activity of the mine operation in the distance. The silver vein that had caused so much death and suffering was now providing honest employment and genuine prosperity for an entire community. The curse that had seemed to hang over the land for decades had been broken by the simple act of bringing the truth to light. Marshal Torres wants to know if you're interested in consulting on other territorial corruption cases. Colt said, your experience uncovering the Blackwood conspiracy has made you something of an expert on exposing illegal mining operations. I might consider it, Delaney replied thoughtfully, but only after we've finished establishing the mining operation and the town is truly stable. Dead Rock Gulch needs to be an example of what honest development can accomplish. The afternoon brought visitors from Phoenix territorial officials and federal representatives who had come to tour the mine and observe the community transformation that had resulted from Delaney's courage in exposing corruption. Among them was William Harrison, the territorial mining commissioner who had helped Uncle Jeremiah secure the unassailable mineral rights that had protected Delaney's inheritance. Mrs. Ramirez, Harrison said formally as he examined the mine's operations, your commitment to ethical business practices and community development has been noted at the highest levels of territorial government. There's talk of using the McGraw Silver Company as a model for mining operations throughout the West. I'm honored by the recognition, Delaney replied, but my goal was never to become famous or influential. I simply wanted to honor my family's legacy and build something good from the wealth Uncle Jeremiah left me. And you've succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, Harrison assured her. The silver beneath your land is providing prosperity for hundreds of people, and your example is inspiring honest business practices throughout the territory. As evening approached and the visitors departed, Delaney and Colt walked together to the small cemetery behind the homestead, where Uncle Jeremiah was buried alongside the symbolic graves they had erected for her parents and Peter Morrison. The setting sun painted the desert mountains in shades of gold and crimson, the same colors that had greeted her on the morning she first discovered the silver that changed her life. Do you think they would be proud of what we've accomplished? Delaney asked, touching the simple headstone that marked Uncle Jeremiah's resting place. I think they would be amazed, Colt replied. Uncle Jeremiah hoped you would find the courage to claim your inheritance. Your parents dreamed of prosperity and justice for their family. Peter Morrison died, trying to expose corruption and protect honest people from criminal exploitation. You fulfilled all of their hopes and dreams. The silver-trimmed hat that had replaced her old patched one caught the last rays of sunlight, its metallic threads gleaming like the precious metal that had brought both danger and redemption to her life. But the hat was more than just a symbol of wealth. It represented the transformation of a poor cowgirl into a successful businesswoman, a community leader, and an advocate for justice. As they walked back to the homestead under the vast desert sky, Delaney reflected on the journey that had brought her from mockery to respect, from poverty to prosperity, from fear to courage. The silver beneath the desert floor had always been valuable, but the strength she had discovered within herself was the true treasure that would last forever. The poor cowgirl who had inherited a seemingly worthless homestead had become the architect of a better future for an entire community. And in the silver-trimmed hat that caught the starlight as darkness fell over Dead Rock Gulch, she carried the reminder that sometimes the greatest fortunes are found not in the ground beneath our feet, but in the courage to stand up for what is right, no matter the cost.